And so there's an imagery of God signifying the acceptance of this offering by the very fact that because being the first fruit, being raised from the dead, then others are raised from the dead. I mean, it is a immediate evidence of this acceptable offering lifted to God by the very fact that others are raised from the dead as well as a part of that offering that was lifted up. And then, of course, there's just the descriptions that are given about the first fruits and the spiritual harvests by Jesus being described. He himself said in John 12, 20, and 23, 32. I just picked, you read the whole section there. But he was, it says this, "Now there were some Greeks among those who went up to worship at the feast." We're referring to this whole week of Passover, unleavened bread, first fruits. And Jesus replied, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. I tell you the truth, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. But I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself." That very expression was the expression that was used in the ceremony of first fruits, of grain being taken out of the ground and lifted up to God from the earth. So when Jesus says that, that's not just a random idea like, oh yeah, kind of like. But he was saying something that they're thinking, first fruits, that's what he's talking about. That's the connection Jesus is making that. And then Paul comes out right in 1 Corinthians 15, 20 through 23, and makes it very clear when he says this, "But Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. For since death came through a man, the resurrection of death comes also through a man. For as in Adam all die, so in Christ all will be made alive. But each in his own turn, Christ the first fruits, then when he comes, those who belong to him." In other words, because of what Christ did on the cross, and we've been reconciled, that because of Christ's death and victory over death and resurrection and his victory in that victory over death, we too, being a part of that harvest of the souls, if you will, are to experience that same blessing. That God, in fact, has received the offering of Christ, his death and resurrection, that he therefore offers the same blessing to us. And that becomes a connection when we see about our own life. What does that mean to us today? And the idea that because God accepted the first fruit of Jesus, he accepts us too. Romans 11:16 says, if the part of the dough offered as first fruits is holy, then the whole batch is holy. If the root is holy, so are the branches. James 1:18, he chose to give us birth through the word of truth, being Jesus, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all he created. And then Jesus himself said, John 14:19, because I live, you also will live. Jesus described in Matthew 9 how the harvest, he says, look out, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. The description of this harvest, the image of the Bible, is the harvest of souls. And the Bible's describing here is the first fruit of the resurrection of those souls. And then what follows with that are the continuing harvesting that is taking place. And we're reminded that if you have any doubt, let me say it this way, if you have any doubt about whether or not God accepts you because of your belief in Jesus Christ, this ought to convince you that there's no reason to. If God himself sets up a feast to be able to acknowledge that the way you do this is you offer up this one sample of the harvest, and if I accept that harvest sample, I accept it all, ought to be able to give us confidence to know that if God himself accepted what Jesus Christ did on the cross, his death and resurrection, and we believe as Jesus, then therefore we are a part of that harvest. We enjoy the same benefits of the victory over death, the resurrection of death, because we are a part of the harvest of what took place through the celebration of the first fruit of Jesus Christ. The other aside I just want to say to you, if you have any people who say, really, do you have to believe in Jesus? Isn't there another way? I'm thinking, man, look at this feast. If this in itself doesn't say no, there's only one way, because unless I accept that offering that is given through Jesus Christ, the whole harvest is tainted. Ought to be able to tell us it has to be through Jesus Christ. There is no other way. Through the very ceremony that God himself set up indicated it had to happen this way. There is no other option. So there's of course is the acknowledgement of this acceptance that we have because of God accepted Jesus. But there's also within this first fruits a reminder that we are to consecrate our life to God through Jesus. That in fact this whole ceremony is about a consecration, a dedication of service and worship to a deity. We consecrate ourselves to God through Jesus Christ. Leviticus 11:44-45 says, I am the Lord your God. Consecrate yourself and be holy, because I am holy. Do not make for yourself unclean by any creature that moves about on the ground. I am the Lord who brought you out of Egypt to be your God. Therefore be holy, because I am holy. Romans 12:1 says, Therefore I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your spiritual act of worship. The Feast of the Firstfruits to us is a reminder of this idea of cleaving to God, of offering ourselves and dedicating ourselves to God. A reminder that when we come together on a Sunday to worship, it's out of a love and a service and an obedience to God and who He is and the relationship we have in Him. It's a reminder of when we take an offering and we bring our offering. One of the reasons we have you come up here is because it's the idea of coming up to the altar and you are offering up, lifting up off the ground the produce that comes from your life and dedicating your offering to God. And saying, this is my offering to you, knowing that you have provided for me, you have cared for me, you have given to me, and you will bless the fruits of the labors that I have when I dedicated themselves. That's part of what takes place. It's not paying bills. It's not, let me throw God a few bucks. It's this whole ceremony of the first fruits of your own life that God says, consecrate your life to me. In all areas of your life, commit them to me, and I will bless you. And that's what these feasts remind us, is this relationship that we have with God. And certainly knowing that we have this relationship through what Christ did on the cross, but also knowing that there's a continual purifying of our life through the removal of that sin, but also a dedication of our life in all of areas of our life to God, and that's by His design. When you look at the idea of consecrating, it wasn't about doing things. They didn't have a list of to-do lists to do stuff. It was about this conscious willingness to just give over your life and recommit and put God at the center, and looking at the areas of your life, which is like the unleavened bread thing, where God isn't at the center and that isn't first, and just recommitting that area and saying, this is an area that God has to be first. When we live life according to that design, the way God lives it, then we experience the blessings that God promises to us. And so we not only experience the peace with God, but we experience the peace of God in all areas of our life. We look at our life and realize the anxiety and the struggles we have are areas where we just need to reconsecrate ourselves and give it back over to God and allow His peace to fill us in that. And that's why Colossians 3:15, where Paul says, let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you were called to peace. What is he saying there? He's saying, let the peace of Christ consecrate yourself, your heart to God, and let that peace rule you. People who... one of the things we can learn from these feasts is that when we live life with anxiety and worry, and we live lives where we just know we're not at peace, there's two things that you can look at. One is the area of either you're living it when there is leaven or sin in your life that you recognize, I need to get that removed. I need to allow Christ to remove that out of my life. Because as long as that's there, I will not be at peace. And the other area is this area of consecration and dedication and commitment, and saying, I know I need to put God first in this area and recommit myself to Him and allow Him to be at the center. And so I want to invite us to this Feast of Firstfruits to consecrate ourselves to God, to cleave to God. Not only to leave the things of our past or to leave the things that we know that hold us back, but to genuinely cleave to Him, to join with Him, to lift your life up to Him and dedicate your life to Him as an offering.